Hello, thank you so much for watching this video. My name's Carly Myers. I'm the host of Made for More podcast, and I wanted to do this video to share with you the top 3 biggest mistakes that I made when I was starting a podcast. And the reason that I want to share them with you is because they were massive mistakes that I made, and I guarantee these are the same mistakes that every single other podcaster is making. I'm not going to make up a random percentage, like, you know, when people are like 80% of other podcasters, I don't know where they get those statistics from, but I am going to say I think that a lot of other podcasters are making these mistakes, and I don't want you to make the same ones. So the first mistake that I made is I waited until everything was perfect and I was totally ready. So I thought I had to have a certain amount of followers on my Instagram before I got started, or I thought my website had to be perfect before I got started. I thought I needed to be the ultimate expert in the subject that I was talking about before I got started, and I just felt like whenever I would kind of get going and then I'd be like, okay, right, I'm going to get started on my podcast now. I'm going to launch my podcast. I'm ready to go. Some kind of imposter syndrome, limiting belief would come in, and it would say you can't start it yet because you haven't done this, or you don't have this amount of followers, or you haven't got this on your website, or you haven't got the perfect opt-in, or blah, 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 blah. All of these crazy things, which resulted in me procrastinating on launching my podcast for 2 years. And it literally took a pandemic and sitting inside my house with nothing else to do for me to finally say, do you know what? I'm ready. Let's just go and figure it out. And honestly, all the things that I was worried about and thinking, well, I can't start my podcast yet because I don't have XYZ. Those XYZ things came once I started the podcast. So once I started the podcast, I got more followers, I got more listeners, I got a bigger audience because loads of them actually found me through the podcast. And then I grew in confidence, I became better, I became more of an expert in the subject that I was talking about, because in the process of starting up a podcast, you're forced to grow and you're forced to level up and become more. And I just became the next level version of myself in the process of putting myself out there. So if you're watching this and you also are in that procrastination station and thinking, well, when I do this or when I have this, then I'll be ready to do a podcast. No, my friend, the podcast comes first, then all the other things go after that. And just remember that everyone that you love and all the podcasts that you listen to now, they all started at the beginning. Like, no one just launched a podcast to millions of downloads and had this huge audience. Everyone started right in the beginning. Everyone was clueless, everyone was figuring it out, and everyone felt like they weren't ready to do it yet. But I promise you, you are so much more ready than you think, and it's the most amazing journey. So that is the biggest mistake that I made. Number 1, do not make that mistake. If you're sitting here now and sitting on an idea of what you want to do, then just go for it. You are so ready, my friend. Hello! Okay, so the second biggest mistake I made when I was starting out a podcast is that I compared myself to every other podcaster out there. So I would listen to other podcast hosts in my niche, people that were also doing mindset or marketing, and I would compare what my show was going to be to their show. But their show was 500 episodes in. They had a team of people behind them that were helping them edit. They had sponsors, they had a lot of money behind them, and they've been doing it a really long time. So for me to compare my first episode, the first time I'd ever done a podcast, to their 500th episode was absolutely crazy, but it really held me back for a really long time. And to be quite honest with you, I just used to think, if that podcast is out there talking about mindset and marketing, why would anyone get on my podcast? You know, she was getting amazing guests and the content on that show was incredible. And I was thinking, why would anyone jump on mine? But the truth is, people buy into people. And although that was a massively successful podcast, and it still is, it doesn't mean to say that someone listening to my podcast isn't going to think, oh, she's a bit of me. She is talking directly to me. I love her energy. I love her vibe. And it doesn't mean to say that, you know, they're going to like her podcast any more than mine, because ultimately, when it comes to podcasting, people are listening to who they want to listen to. They buy into people, and you cannot compare, you know, something that's been going on for so long to your first ever episode. And I'm sure if you ever looked at any of their first episodes, they were just as fumbly and, you know, all over the places as you feel like you are in your first one. But also remember that the average person subscribes to about 7 different podcasts, because one day they might want this, one day they might want that, one day that person's voice might really, really irritate them and they can't bear to listen to it and they just want something a little bit different. So just because, again, there's massively successful podcasts out there doesn't mean to say that that's for everyone. And someone might be logging onto their podcast app and just hoping for exactly what it is that you've got to give. So just trust in what you have and trust that you are going to speak to the exact right people that you need to speak to. Hello! Okay, so the third biggest mistake that I made in my podcasting journey, this is a big one, is that I used to make it all about me. So I remember in some of my early episodes, I actually interviewed someone amazing. She had, over 10 million downloads on her own podcast. She was an incredible woman, really, really seasoned and experienced in the podcasting world. And I really, really looked up to her. And so I reached out to her. I asked her if she would be a guest on my podcast. And I was so grateful and excited when she said yes. But when I got her onto the interview, instead of taking that time to really get to know her and get loads of information out of her to help my listeners, I took that opportunity to kind of show off myself. And when I listen back to that episode now, I realised that I just didn't stop talking. And actually, that's not what it was about. Whoever was logging into that podcast was logging into it because they want to hear from her. Of course they want to hear from me, but really they want to hear her story. And as an interviewer, your job is to really get the juice out of the person that you're interviewing. It's not for you to talk about yourself, and it's not for you to try and impress the person that you're interviewing. So that was definitely a big mistake. And when I look back at that episode now, I think I probably could have done that differently, and I think I could have made more of that opportunity, but that was a massive learning curve. And again, in my solo episodes, in the beginning, I used to really think about how I sounded and, how would someone view me by saying this? And so I would always try and make myself sound impressive or, try and impress people by my actions. But then eventually I learned that if I just focus on the listener and giving them as much value as possible, regardless of how that makes me sound, I'm going to be able to create a much better and more valuable podcast for people. So then I started to become a little bit more vulnerable and just say the truth, really, and really share the truth of stuff. And actually the episodes where I'm the most vulnerable and the most honest, and it perhaps doesn't paint me in a perfect light, but it offers lots of insight into the listener, those are always the ones where I get the most amount of feedback, and they come back to me and say, I love that episode, thank you so much, it really spoke to me. So just remember that if your focus is always on the listener and how you can serve them in the best way possible, regardless of how it makes you come across, then you're always going to be able to create the best episode you possibly can. So I hope that helped. I'm so excited for you on this podcasting journey. Please reach out to me in the DMs on Instagram if you have any questions at all, or if you want a little bit more insight. But I'm just so excited for you, and all I would say is just be you, be bold, don't compare yourself to anyone, don't get held back feeling like you need to do this perfectly. Just take messy, inspired action and know that you are exactly enough as you are.